in the lead up to the big UN climate conference at the end of this year, we are, for the Australian Institute TV, making a little mini series to help explain what is a COP, why is it important, and how is Australia engaging? What we call good cop, bad cop. So to kick things off, Alia, what is a COP?
So our first acronym, COP, stands for Conference of the Parties, and it is the yearly negotiation where all countries come together to negotiate on climate policy. And this year is the 26th COP, so it's COP 26. And as that indicates, they've been going for many decades now, since 1992, where they first began at the Rio Earth Summit.
So at this Rio Earth Summit, this was informed by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which is like the global consensus when it comes to climate science. And what they said is that climate change is likely human-induced. We need to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore we need to come up with a treaty to go ahead and figure out what is the best course of action. And that led to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which I have a copy of right here. But on top of that, it also came up with two other conventions, the Convention on Biological Diversity, the CBD, and the UN Convention to Combat Desertification, the UNCCD. But the UNFCCC, the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, is the most well-known. And given that climate change is all-encompassing, it impacts everything, it is often the one that gets the most attention. And there were, I think, about 197 countries that joined up to the UNFCCC. And underneath that, they eventually agreed on their first plan for how they would reduce their emissions through what's called the Kyoto Protocol. And in that, they agreed that developed countries, those that had industrialized already, would take on commitments to reduce emissions from between 2008 to 2020. I have a copy of the Kyoto Protocol right here. Now, this protocol didn't go to plan. Emission reductions weren't at the level required, and a new treaty was required because the Kyoto Protocol only worked for developed countries. But by the time that we got into the 2010s, there were a lot more greenhouse gas emitters. A lot of developing countries had massively grown and industrialized. We needed a treaty that dealt with all countries. So what came next after the Kyoto Protocol?
That's right. So what came after the Kyoto Protocol is what we call the Paris Agreement. And this came out of the COP in Paris in 2015. And it was a landmark negotiation, a landmark treaty that was agreed upon by every country at the COP, so pretty much every country in the world. And it came down to three key priorities, and that is keeping global warming to safe limits, which is 2 degrees, or aiming for 1.5 degrees global warming. And the 1.5 degree limit really came out of particularly vulnerable countries like Pacific Island nations that were going to feel the impacts of climate more than most other countries. So they really pushed for that stronger ambition. The other two main things that the Paris Agreement agreed upon is to align finance, which means stop financing the problem, which is fossil fuels, which emit greenhouse gases that cause climate change, and that we need to adapt to impacts that we can't avoid. And particularly, we need to help vulnerable countries adapt to those impacts. And it was every country signed up for this, and it was one of the fastest treaties that was ever negotiated and agreed upon. So it really showed how important it was to all the countries who were there at the time.
Even North Korea joined up.
Yes, they did.
But Alia, COPs get a bad rap. The UN climate process gets a bad rap because it doesn't seem like it's moving at the same pace as the science and the call for climate action. And that's, I guess, because it's slow and bureaucratic. And that's because it requires consensus. So whilst it's fantastic having every country in the world that is party to this process, it means you need every country in the world to decide on every single decision. So if you need consensus, what happens is you end up with the lowest common denominator, the bare minimum that everyone can agree to. And that makes it particularly important for countries that aren't really on board or want to drag their feet to actually do more, because unfortunately, they're the ones who set the standard. And that includes who?
Yours truly, Australia.
Australia. That's why getting countries like Australia to do more on climate action allows the bar to be raised for all countries as part of a collective international effort. And there's also one other thing that's part of the Paris Agreement that's particularly important. So Alia went through Article 2, which are the three goals: mitigation, adaptation, and financing. But there's another part to that, and that is that the agreement will be implemented to reflect equity and the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities. Now, that is diplomatic gobbledygook, but what it means is if you can do more as a country, you should do more. And Australia is a rich country. It's in the top 10% of all those countries in terms of its emissions. It is a top 3 country in terms of supplying fossil fuels, the main cause of climate change when they're burnt. So it can and should do more. But why, Alia, is this COP in particular important?
Well, coming back to what you said, Richie, because this is such a slow and bureaucratic process, every time we don't have a COP, we don't get any progress in that world of negotiations and countries coming together to agree on what should be done and how well countries are doing. So last year we didn't have a COP because of the global pandemic. And so just like we had the 2020 Olympics this year, we are having COP26 this year, which is actually technically the 5-year mark since Paris. And every 5 years under the Paris Agreement, all countries come together and review on the progress to the commitments that they'd made, which we call NDCs, which is the nationally determined contributions. Coming back to what Richie said, every country gets to decide the best way that they can contribute to climate action. And they do this in the form of their NDC. This year is the 5-year mark since Paris, so countries are reviewing on their progress that they've made so far, and they're also expected to submit their targets and their ambition for the next 5-year period. So that means that countries who only had a 2025 target up until now have to submit their 2030 target, and countries that already had a 2030 target are encouraged to resubmit their 2030 target with increased ambition. And by encouraged, I mean not forced to increase their ambition, but expected to increase their ambition. And that's why we've seen so many countries increase their targets this year. We've seen the US and the UK and Europe all increase their targets. The US doubled their target from 26% emissions reduction to more than 50% emissions reduction. And for countries like Japan that had already submitted their 2030 target, we've seen them increase their original 2030 target. So they've increased theirs from 26% to 46%. And Australia already had submitted their 2030 target, also 26%. And they have resubmitted their 2030 target as is.
Australia, like the US and Japan, also has a 26% emission reduction target, but didn't increase it and just submitted the same thing again. But basically, like having done an assignment saying, here's my assignment again, can I get the same grade?
Yeah, and they are allowed to do that. But again, what you said, Richie, the countries who can do more are expected to do more. And we are one of those countries, but we haven't done any more this time.
And this has all been informed by the latest science, and that's what makes this whole issue so pressing, right, Alia?
Yeah, that's right. So that's the other thing that will be a hot topic of discussion this year. The IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, is the UN's climate science body, and they released their 6th climate assessment report this year, which basically showed that we are going to hit that 1.5 degree warming target in the next few decades, regardless of what we do now. That doesn't mean that it's too late, but it means we're walking a very fine line between reducing emissions sufficiently to meet the targets globally that we set for ourselves in the Paris Agreement. And so when we all reflect on the commitments that people have made, the countries have made, and how well they've been doing so far at COP26 this year, the IPCC report will be front of mind for everybody, for all of those countries and for the world, as to whether we are in line with what we really should be doing.
And so the UK is hosting the COP in Glasgow, and they've been quite vocal in asking countries to step up their climate ambition. Now, that ideally would take the form of increasing their target, but it can mean particular actions that they should take. And so the COP president, the person who will literally preside over the UN climate conference, a UK minister called Alok Sharma, has said, and I'm quoting him here, "I've been very clear that I want COP26 to be the COP where we consign coal power to history." And I raise this because the UK has gone from having 40% coal power to 2% in the last decade. This is the place that was the birthplace of coal power. And Alok Sharma, to make literal what he is telling all to do, just last weekend blew up a coal-fired power station in the UK. So it's not just about reducing, your emissions by taking on more ambitious targets. It's also taking actions like getting rid of coal power from how you generate electricity, which in Australia is a very large part of our emissions footprint. So the big question is at COP26 this year, will the message be that we're doing enough or that we're falling short?
So the message loud and clear will be that we are not doing enough. And we know that already because of the IPCC report. And the COP26 will show concretely that we're not doing enough. And it will be a loud call to all countries to do more, to do better.
And so the final question is it too late then?
No, it's not too late. We can still turn things around. Every fraction of warming is warming that will have awful impacts. So anything that we can avoid, we should be avoiding. And it's up to all countries, including Australia, to be part of that.
Over the next few weeks, you'll be hearing a lot more around the COP. You'll be seeing governments, including the Australian government, put forward its long-term plan, explain whether it's going to be committing to net zero by 2050, explain what actions it's taking place, or alternatively, why it shouldn't be doing more. And you'll be hearing from state governments, you'll be hearing from organizations, you'll be hearing from industry that are all gearing into climate action and putting on the table their contribution, because really we all have a role to play. So as we get closer and closer to it, we'll be unpacking what all these different commitments and engagements look like, and explaining and unspinning what the Australian government might put forward as well. So we hope you can join us for the rest of our Good Cop, Bad Cop mini-series.
Subscribe to Australia Institute TV. Next time we'll be diving into more of what makes a good cop versus a bad cop and what we can expect from COP26 this year.